It was 9 degrees the night Rosalind Petrov gave her coat to a dying man. She found him at the mouth of the alley behind the diner where she worked the graveyard shift, a man in a ruined suit, face down in the snow, blood freezing black beneath him. No one else on that street stopped. 2 people crossed to the other side. Rosalind was a big woman. 36 years old, heavy, plain, the sort of woman the world was long done looking at. And she was cold, and she was tired, and she had exactly 1 coat to her name. She knelt down in the snow. She took it off. She wrapped it around a stranger who was already half gone, and she held him, and she talked to him so he wouldn't be alone, until the black cars came howling out of the dark and took him from her arms. She never told them her name. She never asked his. And when Salvatore Draga, the most powerful man in Cleveland, finally woke up 11 days later, he could not remember a single thing about the night he almost died. Nothing but a voice in the dark. And the weight of a warm coat that smelled of coffee and cinnamon. He would spend the next 4 months tearing his city apart looking for her. And what he'd find when he finally found her would nearly cost them both their lives. Here is how it happened. Rosalind Petrov had worked the overnight at the Starlight Diner for 11 years. It was a hard life and an honest one. She had her regulars, the cab drivers, the nurses coming off shift, the lonely men who came in at 3 in the morning because a diner is the only place in America that will have you at 3 in the morning. She knew all their orders. She knew all their names. She had a way of remembering things about people that made them feel, for 20 minutes over a plate of eggs, like somebody in this world had actually noticed them. That was Rosalind's gift, and nobody who mattered had ever known she had it. She remembered everything. Not in a vague way. Not the way people mean when they say they've got a good memory. Rosalind Petrov had the kind of mind that recorded voices, faces, numbers, the exact words a stranger said in a booth 6 years ago. She'd been that way since she was a child. Her mother had called it a party trick. Her teachers had called it cheating. Nobody had ever called it what it was, which was extraordinary, because extraordinary things are hard to see when they come packaged in a heavy, quiet girl who never made a fuss. So she waited tables. And she remembered everything. And nobody ever asked her a single question worth the asking. Until the night of the snow. She'd stepped into the alley at 2 in the morning to haul out the trash, and there he was. The man was maybe 45. Somebody had shot him, twice she'd learn later. And he'd made it a long way through the snow before his body simply stopped. His skin was gray. His lips were blue. He was, by every measure that mattered, 10 minutes from dead. Rosalind was not a nurse. She had no idea what she was doing. She only knew what her grandmother had taught her about the cold, which was that the cold takes you long before the wound does. So she took off her coat. It was a bad coat. A cheap one, worn through at the elbows, the only one she had. And she'd walk home in a wet apron that night and she'd cough for 2 weeks after. She didn't think about any of that. She wrapped it around him and she got down in the snow and she put her whole warm body against his cold one, because heat is heat and she had some and he had none. And she talked to him. Hey, mister, stay with me now. My name's Rosalind and you're going to be all right, you hear? Don't you go anywhere. It's 9 degrees and I have gone to considerable trouble here. His eyes opened. Just barely. He looked up at her. This big plain stranger holding him in an alley in a snowstorm, and something moved in his frozen face. Why, he managed. Because you're a person, she said. And nobody should die alone in the snow with people walking right past. That's it. That's the whole reason. He tried to say something else and couldn't. And that was when Rosalind Petrov, holding him, heard the 2 men come to the mouth of the alley. They didn't see her. That was the thing. She was down in the shadows behind the dumpster, a heavy shape in a dark apron, invisible the way she'd been invisible her whole life. They stood not 15 feet away, breath steaming, and they talked. And Rosalind's terrible, beautiful, useless memory recorded every single word. He's not in the alley. A low voice, a smoker's rasp. He crawled off. He's dead somewhere or he will be. And if he's not? A younger man, nervous. Then he wakes up with 2 in him and no memory and we're the loyal soldiers who found him. Either way it goes to Bishop. That was the arrangement. A pause. A cigarette flaring. Marco doesn't say the name. Nobody says the name. Bishop moves the shipments through the west docks and Draga goes in the ground, and the family never knows we opened the door for him. You just keep your mouth shut and you get everything he had. Then the black cars came. and the two men melted away, and other men were shouting and hands were taking the bleeding stranger from her arms. Rosalind stood up in the snow in her wet apron shaking, and no one looked at her twice. Nobody asked. She was the fat waitress by the dumpster. She was furniture. The cars roared away. And she stood there for a long moment with her arms empty and a conversation burning in her head that she was certain, absolutely certain, would get her killed if she ever repeated it. So she went inside. She finished her shift. She told no one. That was the first mistake, hers and everyone's. Salvatore Draga woke up 11 days later in a private room with a doctor on the payroll and two men at his door. He'd been dead twice on the table. His body had come back. His memory had not. The whole night was gone. The meeting he'd gone to. The men who'd shot him. Everything erased by cold and blood loss. And the doctors told him gently that this was normal, that traumatic amnesia was common, that he shouldn't chase it. Except there was one thing. There was a voice. He didn't remember a face. He didn't remember a name. But when he closed his eyes he could hear a woman talking to him in the dark, warm and steady and a little exasperated, saying, "Don't you go anywhere. It's 9 degrees and I have gone to considerable trouble here." He could feel the weight of a coat that smelled of coffee and cinnamon. He could feel a stranger's body pressed against his, giving him her heat, when every other soul in that city had walked on by. And in a life of 45 years, a life of blood and cold arithmetic, of 100 men who'd smiled at him and wanted something, that woman was the only person Salvatore Draga had ever met who had given him something and asked for nothing at all. He didn't even know she was real. He half believed he'd invented her out of the dark. But he sat up in that hospital bed and he made himself a promise. Find her, he told Marco, his underboss, his oldest friend. The woman from the alley. She saved my life. Find her and bring her to me. And Marco Vitali, steady loyal Marco, who had stood at his shoulder for 20 years, looked him in the eye and said, "Of course, Sal. I'll turn the city over." Marco had no intention of finding her. Because Marco knew there had been a witness. His man had seen a shape in the shadows by the dumpster, a heavy woman, gone by the time they'd looked again. And if Salvatore Draga ever found the woman who'd held him in the snow, she might have heard two men talking about a name. The name was Bishop. And the man who'd opened the door for Bishop was Marco Vitali. So the search began. And it was a strange, doomed, beautiful thing. Because Salvatore Draga meant it. He tore Cleveland open looking for her. He had men canvass every block within a mile of that alley. He offered money, serious money, for any woman who came forward. And a dozen did, of course, because there is always someone willing to lie for money. And he sat across from every one of them and asked them to say the words, and none of them ever said the right ones because none of them had a voice that matched the one in his head. He did not know he was looking for a diner 300 feet from where he'd fallen. And Rosalind Petrov, who read the papers and heard the whispers, who knew exactly who the man in the snow had been the moment his face was on the front page. Rosalind Petrov said nothing. She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But she'd heard two men in that alley plan to hand him to someone called Bishop. And she'd heard them say the family didn't know, which meant someone close to him had done it. And who would believe a fat waitress over a made man? Who would protect her? She was nobody. She had no one. She'd be dead in a week, and he'd still be surrounded by men who wanted him dead, and nothing would change. So she carried it. All winter. Every night in that diner, remembering the exact weight of him in her arms, and the exact words those two men said, and never once telling a living soul. She stopped wearing coats. She couldn't stand to. There was a night in February she nearly broke. A customer left a newspaper on the counter, and his face was on it. Some charity gala, some photograph, Salvatore Draga in a black tie looking like a man carved out of winter. She stood there with her rag in her hand for a long time, staring at that photograph, and she thought, I held you. I have held you and you don't know my name. She thought about walking into whatever building he lived in and saying so. She got as far as putting on her shoes. Then she imagined it the way it would actually go. The men at the door looking her up and down, the pity, the laughter, the phone call to Marco Vitali to come deal with the crazy heavy woman claiming she'd saved the boss's life. She took her shoes off. She made herself a cup of tea. And she went to bed and lay awake until her alarm went off for the graveyard shift. That's the thing nobody understands about being invisible. After enough years, you don't just get overlooked by the world. You start doing the overlooking yourself. You look at your own life, your own worth, the extraordinary thing you did in an alley in the snow, and you think that couldn't have been me. Who would believe that was me? And 100 miles away in his own house, a man who had never in his life wanted anything he couldn't take sat awake at 3 in the morning, listening for a voice he could not find. He'd become something close to obsessed, and he knew it. His men exchanged looks. Marco told him gently that maybe the doctors were right, maybe the whole thing was invented, maybe there had been no woman at all, a hallucination out of the cold, a dying brain's kindness to itself. And that thought was the only one that Salvatore Draga could not bear. Because if she wasn't real, then it was true after all. He'd been a man dying alone in the snow with the whole world walking past, and nobody had stopped and nobody would have. It's 9 degrees and I have gone to considerable trouble here. Who are you? Salvatore Draga said to his empty room. He found her in April. Not because of the search. Because of the snow. There was a late storm, a freak one, wet and heavy, the kind Cleveland gets when spring lies to you. And Salvatore, restless as he'd been for 4 months, had his car take him back to that alley. He did that sometimes. Stood in the mouth of it. Waited for the memory to come. It didn't come. It never came. But across the street, a diner's neon buzzed against the falling snow. And through the window, he watched a heavy woman in a waitress's uniform lean over a table and refill an old man's coffee, and say something that made the old man laugh, and touch his shoulder as she went by. She had a way of moving, this woman. Like the room was hers to take care of. Salvatore Draga stood in the snow and watched her for 4 full minutes and didn't know why he couldn't look away. Then he crossed the street and went inside and sat down at the counter and said, "Coffee, please." And Rosalind Petrov turned around. He watched every drop of color leave her face. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "are you all right?" And she opened her mouth, and the words that fell out of her were not the ones she meant to say. They were the ones that had lived in her mouth for 4 months, the ones she'd rehearsed 1,000 times and sworn she'd never speak. "You're supposed to be dead," Rosalind whispered. "They said you'd be dead." Salvatore Draga went completely still, because he knew that voice. He had been hearing it in the dark for 4 months. The coffee pot was shaking in her hand. He reached out very slowly, the way you'd approach something wild, and took it from her and set it down on the counter. "Say it again," he said. His own voice had gone strange. "Mr. Draga, please." And Salvatore Draga, who had not said please to another human being in 20 years, gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles went white. "Say something else. Anything. Just keep talking." Rosalind looked at him, this man she'd held while he died, standing in her diner asking her to speak. "It was 9 degrees, she said quietly. "You were bleeding into the snow, and there were 2 people who crossed the street to get away from you. And I told you not to go anywhere, because I had gone to considerable trouble." For a long moment Salvatore Draga did not move at all. Then he put both hands over his face, this enormous, dangerous man, and stood in a diner at 6 in the morning and wept, for the first time since he was a child, for a woman he had believed he'd invented, who was standing 3 feet away refilling coffee for cab drivers, 300 feet from where he had almost died. "You're real," he said. "I'm real," Rosalind said. "I couldn't find you." His voice broke on it. "God help me, I looked everywhere. I looked everywhere." "I know." She reached across the counter and, for the second time in her life, took his cold hand in her warm one. "I'm sorry. I was afraid." She swallowed. "Sit down, Mr. Draga. There's something I need to tell you, and you're not going to like it." They sat in that empty diner until the sun came up. She told him everything. Every word she'd heard the 2 men say. She said them back exactly, in the 2 men's own cadence, the smoker's rasp and the nervous younger one, because she remembered them the way she remembered everything. "Bishop moves the shipments through the west docks and Draga goes in the ground, and the family never knows we opened the door for him." And Salvatore listened, and his face went to stone, and Rosalind watched a man understand in real time that his oldest friend had sold him. "You've had this for 4 months, he said quietly. "Why didn't you come to me?" "Because who would have believed me?" She laughed, a broken little sound. "Look at me, Mr. Draga. I'm the fat waitress from the graveyard shift. Men like you don't listen to women like me. Nobody ever has. Not once in 36 years. She wrapped her hands around her cold coffee cup. And your man Marco is the one who would have come to check my story. I'd have been dead by Thursday and nobody in this world would have even noticed I was gone. Salvatore Draga looked at this woman. This quiet, heavy, extraordinary woman who had given a stranger her only coat and then carried his murder in her head for 4 months, alone and frightened, because she believed nobody would listen to her. And for the first time in a life built on iron, something in his chest cracked wide open. I noticed, he said. I have been looking for you every single day since I woke up. I have had 30 men searching this city. I have sat in a chair at 3 in the morning listening for your voice. He reached across the counter and very gently took her hand. You are the only person in my entire life who ever gave me something and wanted nothing back. I didn't know your name. I didn't know your face. And you have been the only thing on my mind for 4 months. His thumb moved across her knuckles. Rosalind. That was the name you told me in the snow. I remembered it wrong for weeks. I thought I dreamed it. Rosalind. She was crying. She hadn't meant to. You remembered my name? I remembered your voice, he said. It's the only thing that kept me here. For 3 weeks after that, Salvatore Draga came to the Starlight Diner every night at 2 in the morning and sat at the counter and let a waitress refill his coffee. His men thought he'd lost his mind. Let them. He'd spent his whole life in rooms where every word was a transaction, and now he had a woman who talked to him about nothing at all, about the cab driver whose daughter was starting college, about the way the snow sounded different at 4 a.m. than at midnight, about a customer 6 years ago who'd left a poem on a napkin that she could still recite word for word. You could recite anything, he said one night, marveling. Couldn't you? It's not much of a gift. Rosalind shrugged, wiping the counter. You can't eat it. It just means I never get to forget the bad parts either. It means, Salvatore said, that you are the most valuable person in this city, and nobody ever bothered to ask you a single question. He turned his cup slowly. Do you know what I've noticed sitting here? Every person who walks through that door, you look at their face. First thing. Before the order. Nobody does that. Not one person in my world has looked at my face in 20 years. They look at my hands to see if I'm reaching for something. Rosalind looked up at him then, and neither of them said anything for a while, and something in that quiet was warmer than any coat. Marco moved fast once he understood. He'd had a man watching the diner within a day, because Marco was not a fool, and Marco knew what it meant when Salvatore Draga started spending his evenings on a counterstool at the Starlight talking to a waitress until dawn. He knew what she must have heard, and he knew that a witness who could recite a private conversation word for word was the only thing standing between him and everything Salvatore had. He came for her on a Tuesday in the dark, in the parking lot behind the diner. He came himself because some things you don't hand to another man. And what saved Rosalind Petrov's life that night was the thing that had shaped her whole life. Nobody had ever paid attention to her, so she had spent 36 years paying attention to everybody else. She had noticed the car 3 nights running. She had noticed the same man buying cigarettes across the street at exactly the hour her shift ended. She had noticed, and she had told Salvatore, and Salvatore's men had been in that parking lot before Marco Vitali ever got there. It ended quickly. She didn't watch. She stood inside the diner with her hands pressed flat on the counter, and she looked at the coffee pot, and she did not watch. Afterward, Salvatore came inside with snow in his hair. And Rosalind, who had never in her life been anything other than gentle, asked the only question she needed answered. Is it finished? It's finished, he said. Marco. Bishop. All of it. It's finished, and it's finished because of you. He crossed the empty diner. Rosalind. I have to tell you what happens now, and I need you to understand it's not a debt. It was never a debt. Then what is it? And Salvatore Draga, the most powerful man in Cleveland, a man who had never in his life asked anyone for anything, got down on one knee on the tile floor of the Starlight Diner at 4 in the morning. The night you found me, he said, I had 2 bullets in me and I was going into the snow. I want you to understand something because I've had 4 months to think about it and I've never been more certain of anything. I wasn't afraid of dying. Men like me make peace with dying early. What I was afraid of, what I understood, lying in that alley with the cold coming up through my back, was that I was going to die and there would not be one single person in this world who was sorry. Not one. That's the life I'd built. He looked up at her. And then a stranger knelt down in the snow and gave me her only coat and told me not to go anywhere. You didn't know I was rich. You didn't know I was powerful. As far as you knew, I was a nobody bleeding out behind a diner, and you gave me everything you had anyway." His voice went rough. "Do you know what that did to a man like me? Do you have the first idea?"
Salvatore.
"You have been the one warm thing in my whole life," he said. "I don't want to repay you. You can't repay something like that. I want to keep you. I want to spend whatever years I have left proving to you that the woman who thought nobody in this world would even notice if she vanished, that woman is the only person I have ever loved." He took her hand. "The men out there call me a king. It's a stupid word. But if it's true, then I'm telling you. I don't want a queen who was born to it. I want the woman who was down in the snow. Be my wife, Rosalind. Come out of the cold." And Rosalind Petrov, the heavy waitress, the invisible woman, the one who remembered everything and was remembered by no one, put her hand against the face of the man she'd held in an alley, and finally let herself be seen. "I never got my coat back, you know," she said, half laughing, half sobbing. "No," Salvatore agreed, standing, gathering her in. "You didn't. You'll have to take mine instead. And everything else I own. And every single day I've got left." They were married in the snow the next winter. Her idea, not his. She wanted it outside on the corner where she'd found him in the cold, with the whole of that old neighborhood watching. The cab drivers and the nurses and the lonely men from the graveyard shift, all of them there, because she'd fed them at 3 in the morning for 11 years and every one of them came. And here is the part one loved best. Because Rosalind Petrov, who never forgot anything, never forgot what it was to be cold and unseen either. She kept working the diner for a while, though she certainly didn't have to. And then she bought it. And then she did something with all that money that made the whole city talk. Every winter at the Starlight there's a rack by the door. It's full of coats. Good ones, warm ones, and you don't have to say anything or sign anything or prove anything. You just take one. The sign above it is small and hand-painted, and it doesn't have her name on it, because Rosalind was never one to make a fuss. It just says, "Nobody should be cold." And on the worst nights of the year when the snow comes down over Cleveland, you can sometimes see a big man in an expensive coat standing by that rack, handing them out himself one at a time to strangers who have no idea who he is. He doesn't tell them. He never tells them. He just remembers what one coat, from one woman nobody was looking at, did for a man who was going into the ground. So that's the story of the heavy waitress who gave away her only coat in the snow, the woman the whole world walked straight past, who turned out to be holding the one secret that could save a king, and the one heart he'd spend the rest of his life keeping warm. I want to ask you something tonight, and I really want to know, so tell me down in the comments. 2 people walked past that man in the snow before Rosalind found him. 2. And I've thought about them a lot because I don't think they were monsters. I think they were just cold and tired and in a hurry the way we all are. So here's my question. Have you ever been the one who stopped? Or have you ever been the one who was stopped for? Tell me that story. I promise you somebody scrolling past tonight needs to read it. And if Rosalind reminded you that the smallest kindness, offered by the person the world overlooks, can change absolutely everything, do me one favor before you go. Tap that like button, share this with someone who's been out in the cold too long, and subscribe, because the next story is one I can't wait for you to hear. You will not believe who walks through that door. I'll see you there.